Shadow Minister.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Today is Valentine's Day, an opportunity to express to those who matter most that they are valued and respected and show them the kindness and compassion that they deserve. Most importantly, it's a day to show our loved ones that we are there for them. So today, on Valentine's Day, I'm once again calling on the Prime Minister and the Premier to show the people of Williamtown that their government is there for them. Because after 2.5 years living a nightmare, the families affected by the toxic PFAS contamination flowing from the RAF-based Williamtown are nothing short of heartbroken. For 7 years, they've been lied to. They've had secrets kept from them, they've been hurt emotionally and financially, and they've been treated with disdain by multiple levels of government, each more concerned about limiting liability than looking after those they've hurt. As more time passes and the Commonwealth Government continues to drag its heels and offer no real progress, the communities affected are getting closer and closer to breaking point. I've said many times in this place, and I'll say it again now, we know who the polluter is, it's Defence. And we know ultimately that Defence and the Commonwealth is responsible for fixing this catastrophe. But the fact does not allow the New South Wales Government and the EPA to abrogate its responsibilities to the primary it is the primary environmental regulator in our state. If a private company had committed this contamination, the Premier, the Environment Minister and the EPA would be demanding and enforcing action. And yet when it comes to this issue and these desperate families, we see no tough words from Premier Berejiklian or the Environment Minister Gabrielle Upton. And within the community, their continued silence is deafening. Meanwhile, of course, we've seen a host of other New South Wales ministers happy to call out the Commonwealth Government on matters that they consider a priority, including, by the way, the Deputy Premier outright attacking the Prime Minister and calling for his resignation for committing the cardinal sin of losing opinion polls. And yet, on this issue, our Environment Minister does not consider the Williamtown contamination to be a significant enough matter to publicly demand action from the feds. We're now getting to a stage where you could reasonably question whether the New South Wales Government is running a protection racket for Defence, or do they just not care about the families and what happens to them? But it gets worse. Recently, families living on Cabbage Tree Road in the red zone had another truckload of pain dumped on them, courtesy of this heartless government. Unbelievably, these families, whose members have high levels of PFAS in their blood, who've recently had to fight off raging bushfires at their back fence that have threatened to engulf their homes, have now received phone calls from the Department of Planning informing them that the proposed sand mine that has been plaguing the community for 3 years now has now been given the tick of approval. These families are already on the precipice, and you do this to them. I seriously don't know how they are meant to cope with this latest news on top of everything else. It's been announced that the sand mine will now proceed to the Planning Assessment Commission for final assessment. My community should not be having to have this fight. The sand mine tender was dodgy from the start, with Port Stephens Council issuing the tender and accepting the bid from the then Mayor himself. He then withdrew his tender just so he could be in the room when the tender decision was being made. The tender was then awarded to a Tinkler, Buildev-related company against the advice of council staff. Port Stephens Council was the only entity at that time still willing to do any business with Nathan Tinkler-related companies. Since then, due to the inevitable inability of Tinkler or Buildev to fulfil their obligations under the tender, it was transferred to another 2 companies, seemingly independent from the original businesses, without any other formal tender process. And yet we hear that the significant people involved with the original company are still involved with the new company. It all stinks to high heaven. It did from the start and it hasn't stopped. Right now, the sand mine sits conveniently out of the new area identified by the EPA as being affected by the contamination, while neighbouring residential properties are included in the red zone. Now, we know that vegetation and other materials from within the red zone, like weeds from the drains, cannot be removed from the area because there is no safe way to dispose of it. And yet the sand mine has been approved by the department with the potential for contaminated material being trucked across the state, damage being done to the local aquifer. It just beggars belief. Prior to Christmas, the Premier finally met with residents affected by the contamination. She heard of their heartache and despair firsthand. So I'm calling on the Premier to have a heart this Valentine's Day and intervene in the cruel, heartless decision of the Sydney-based Department of Planning to halt this sand mine. Given all of the circumstances, shouldn't we at least be suspending the process until there's greater understanding of the impact of PFAS on human health, or at least until the residents are given options to escape the area? Because unlike any other unwanted development around the state, these families cannot escape. escape. People in the red zone cannot leave. Have a heart, Premier, and do the right thing and stop this sand mine.
Order. I call